So you want to be a knight. So do I, join the club. But it might be more realistic for you than it is for me. You might be wondering what a knight does. How do you become a knight? How do knights train? What do they wear? What code do they follow? Who are they? That's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And although most of what I'm about to say can be applied to a larger time frame, we're going to focus and do a full overview on the 14th century knight. I despise introductions, so we're just going to launch right into it. Could anyone be a knight? No, not everyone could be a knight. Generally speaking, women could not become knights. As for men, let's start with the poor man. If you're a peasant man, if you're low-born, theoretically, it's not impossible. It's just not going to be easy. Let's say you're in feudal 14th century England. You're a peasant man. You've just received your call to war. You are infantry. You're a foot soldier. In this hypothetical situation, there is an opportunity for you to become a knight. Like I said, it's just not going to be easy. But there is a chance. You are going to have to do something very heroic on the battlefield, deserving of recognition. Beyond recognition, actually, deserving of the accolade, which was the act of dubbing a knight. That said, this was not common. I would not recommend it. You might get yourself killed, for instance, instead of becoming a knight. If I was born a peasant, I wouldn't set my heart on becoming a knight. I mean, go for it. If you've got nothing to lose, go for it. But it's just not the preordained path for that social stratum. That's not to say that if you're from a peasant family that is free and has been rising through the ranks of government or religion, that you can't become a knight, because that did happen. Once your social status rose high enough, you would be able to be considered for knighthood. Again, easier said than done. Raising your whole family out of poverty and rising through the social ranks, which can only get you so far, that's not super common. But there were men who, in all honesty, were born to be knights. And these were the sons of knights, princes, magnates, noble-born sons who were younger sons. They were not the firstborn. Firstborn sons essentially got, if not everything, then an overwhelming chunk of the inheritance from their parents. Usually most of the estates went to the firstborn son, the money, family belongings. If you were second, third, fourthborn, the farther down the line you are, the less you inherit. The less you inherit, the less you have to offer to a potential bride's family, the less valuable you are as a groom. In which case, if you are not the firstborn, it would be beneficial and even expected of you in some cases, to become a knight. So these members of the nobility, the royal house, the gentry, were really the typical people that were becoming knights. It was not, in general, a peasant's career. It was never expected that a peasant would become a knight. It was more of an exception when they did. So first piece of advice, if you want to be a knight, try not to be born a peasant. Side note, funny enough, I get so distracted. Funny enough, in the 13th century and into the 14th century a bit, a lot of men who were able to become knights avoided getting knighted for many reasons, but among those reasons was the sheer cost of the knighting ceremony and the responsibilities that fell on them if they were to become a knight. As a result, Henry III started forcing gentry and landowners whose estates were worth more than 20 pounds to be knighted. And this was called distraint of knighthood. And it continued on a bit into the 14th century. Essentially, the government had to force people into knighthood for a little while. Now that we know who becomes a knight, we will follow the journey of how to become a knight. First of all, one specific knight that I'd like to distinguish here is the household knight, also known as hearth troops. These knights were very close to their king or lord. In return for service to the lord, which meant basically being a bodyguard unit, carrying messages, forming escorts, and being his immediate surrounding defense on the battlefield. In return for all of that, the lord paid for these knights' living costs and their upkeep. These household knights lived with the lord at whatever estate he was residing in at the time. And this little group of knights who were really close to their lord were called the familia. Anyway, now that I've covered that, the feudal system was still in use at this time, but the feudal summons was sort of going out of fashion. This was for several reasons, some of which being people just didn't want to do it, and mercenaries were being used more and more. But usually the period that was required of an armed man each year was 40 days. By the 1200s, less and less knights were being sent by barons. I should also mention scutage, which is essentially a way to avoid your feudal summons. If you were a knight and you didn't want to acknowledge your feudal summons, or even if you were old, sick, or incapacitated, or if you were a woman or a landowner who had religious affiliations, you could pay a certain amount of money, called scutage, to the king in place of your service, and the king could then use this money to buy troops in your place. The term scutage literally means shield money, and it started becoming more popular beginning in the 1100s. Basically a tax you could pay to get out of service. Anyway, Back to becoming a knight. If you're the son of a knight, you're basically taught from birth to be a knight. You will be raised with your mother until you are 7 years old. You'll live in her household, at which point you will begin training as a page. And you can complete this training at home, or you can go to another noble house and complete it. This level, at the page level, you are instructed by the next rank above you, which is squire. As a page, you will learn a lot of things. You will learn how to wield a sword. You'll practice with the pell, which is basically a post. It's a post. You will learn hunting, hawking, how to wield a bow and arrow. You will learn how to skin and prepare animals for cooking, horse riding, and tilting at the quinton or the ring. Of course, you wouldn't be full on jousting at this point. Jousting at the quinton. The quinton was sort of a dummy, usually a wooden dummy, and it had attached to the other end of it a bag of sand, and you had to, the goal was to hit it with your lance and then keep going as fast as you could so that the bag of sand didn't swing around and hit you in the back. The ring it's a lot more simple. It's just you string a ring up somewhere, maybe from the branch of a tree, and you joust, you tilt at it, you joust at it, and you run at it with your lance, and you try to get your lance through the hoop and catch the ring. But you learn boxing, running, wrestling. You learn how to do smaller tasks like taking care of the dogs or the horses, waiting on knights at the dinner table, carving meat, cleaning armor and weaponry. Side note, did you know that pages would clean knights' armor by rubbing it in a barrel of sand? The page also learned more refined pastimes, such as learning French and Latin, both important at this time. They learned singing, dancing. They were taught how to read and write by lower level clergy, traveling troubadours, or sometimes the ladies of the house. Those ladies also sometimes taught the page manners and grooming techniques as well. If the page, for whatever reason, refused to learn a certain subject, the squire was fully permitted to hurt him. You serve as a page for 7 years, so you should be around 14 when you start apprenticing under a real knight as a squire. As a squire, it is not necessarily guaranteed that you will become a knight. There were many men who remained squires their whole lives, simply because they didn't receive the accolade. They weren't dubbed as knights. This could have been the case if your family couldn't afford the ceremony or the equipment needed to become a knight. This wasn't really a bad thing. There were plenty of job options for you if you chose to remain a squire. You could be a herald, you could be a poet, which is what Geoffrey Chaucer did. They retained a lot of the same duties from being a page. They served their lord and other knights, waited on them at banquets, made their beds, helped the knights to dress, slept in or at the door of the knight's chamber, took care of the dogs and horses. They were also allowed to serve the ladies of the house and were closer to them than a page would have been. During tournaments, you as a squire would go with your knight, standing off to the side and preparing his horses and equipment. On campaign, a knight would bring 2 squires with him, and they would fight with him and make sure he was well equipped with horses and weaponry. Once you reach the point of being a squire, you really start to get deeper into the practice of combat and jousting. So first the squire will start practicing without any chainmail or other armor on, and then once he gets accustomed to bearing the weapons and lances, he will then start training with chainmail on, which was very important because an aspiring knight really needed to get a feel for and get used to carrying the quite heavy armor on his person and still remain fully lethal in combat. This chainmail could weigh up to 50 to 60 pounds, so it was crucial that the squire develop the strength to bear essentially all of this weight on his shoulders. The squire also continued his education in courtly and chivalric pursuits, such as dancing, poetry, hunting, hawking. They were also trained in blazonry, which essentially gives them the ability to recognize coats of arms. After completing all of your training as a squire, you would become knighted in a ceremony. If you were a prince or the son of a great lord, you have a pretty nice ceremony. You would get knighted, often by a king. The ceremony can sort of be seen as developing from a variety of places, but one of them is a ritual that Germanic tribes practiced. In Germanic tribes in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, when a boy came of age, another adult male, such as his relative, father, or tribal chief, would hand him a sword and shield, and he would be considered a warrior in the tribe from then on. We also see a sort of ceremony of manhood like this in ancient Rome when they gave him the toga of manhood, which I believe they received it at around 12 or 13, and it symbolized their change from a boy into a man. In the 10th and 11th 7th centuries, France and Northern England, of course, had a similar ceremony to the knighting ceremony in which they would elevate a foot soldier into a knight. If you were not rich, you might still have a religious ceremony with mass, and sometimes you would just be dubbed right on the battlefield, right before a battle, so that you as a newly made knight could lead troops that were in need of leading, because otherwise you could not lead them if you were not a knight. Mostly in lower class cases, the events could be really rushed. So, now that you're a knight, what are you gonna wear? Definitely chainmail. You would have been wearing chainmail in some fashion, whether it was a hauberk, an aventail. Chainmail was, at this time, starting to be replaced by plate armor, but it didn't go fully out of fashion. It was still used, it didn't fade out completely. There were hauberks that had sleeves going all the way down your arm and ending in a little mitten, which sort of had a leather glove built into this side, so you have leather glove on the inside and then chainmail on the outside, and then there would be a little hole right here that you could use to get your hand out of the mitten. The chainmail would often have a coif attached to it that went over the head, but it never sat directly on the head. There would always be some sort of padding or an arming cap underneath the coif to protect the head. There was a detached form of the coif that started to emerge around the mid-1200s, but the attached version was what was still mostly used. Male leggings or chausses were worn over brays, which were just medieval trousers. I mean, they have some differences. You could put a girdle around it, and then you could attach objects to your girdle inside the brays, or they had strings usually on the end of the trousers in which you could those up to your waist and tie them up around your waistband so that your leggings would be shortened, and working men use this a lot. But underneath the chainmail was worn a gambeson. This is called a million different things, if you care. This was a padded jacket that was worn underneath the chainmail to protect the skin from bruising, or if the chain links were to break and dig into the skin. Sort of a precursor to plate armor was the cuirass, which was a piece of leather body armor which buckled on the sides. There was also the coat of plates, which is it's sort of hard to explain since there aren't many references to it in art because it was almost always covered by a surcoat over the top of it, but it was essentially a piece of transitional armor which was worn over the torso and had plates riveted inside of cloth. The later you go into the 14th century, the more likely you are to be wearing plate armor, which was the type of armor that began replacing chainmail in the mid-13th century. Plate armor was much more effective in providing protection to its wearer, more so in the largest open spots. So over the chest and stomach, the steel was thicker than on the sides, for example. This meant that while those in plate armor were comparatively well protected when considering those just in mail, it was not impossible to take down a man with plate armor. There were weak points. With plate armor, gauntlets were worn. Sometimes these were flared out at the cuff, sometimes not. The hourglass gauntlet became popular around 1350, and they often had gadlings, which were... I love gadlings. Gadlings were low spikes on the knuckles and finger joints of the gauntlet, which served as sort of knuckle dusters. As for leg armor, there were cuisses, which were protection for the thighs, and above this were polanes, which were just more centralized knee protection. These polanes could be riveted to the mail, which was underneath of them, or attached to the cuisses. For your shins, you could use shin balds. They would go over your chausses. These weren't really used much. For your elbows, you could wear elbow cops, which were just plate elbow protection. There were ailets, which were rectangular pieces of wood or leather. Sometimes they had a circle or diamond shape, but that was more rare. You wore them on your shoulder to signify your coat of arms. After 1350, you wouldn't really be wearing ailets, they kind of just tossed them out. At the mid-century point, you would probably be wearing sabatons. These are the cutest thing. Oh my god. They have all these layers of sheet metal or iron plates riveted together to create an articulated piece of armor. And so these sabatons are pretty well articulated. In the 1300s, your sabatons would be pointed at the tip, but a bit later on, maybe in the 16th century, they started rounding them off. It might not look like it from these photos, but these sabatons only covered the top and sides of your feet. So you'd be walking around in your normal shoes, your sole would be your normal shoe, and the sabaton would probably be strapped underneath the foot and cover the top and sides of your shoe. As for helmets, oh, I'm not gallicizing this, I'm sorry, sue me. The cervelier was a steel bowl that you put on your head and called a helmet. It's only covered the ears. And honestly, that was iffy. There were a lot that didn't cover your ears either. These, for most of the century, had a mail curtain riveted on the insides of the helmet, so they didn't need a coif. Before this though, up until around 1330, they were shown to be wearing a coif and a helmet on top of the coif, but we're not exactly sure what was worn between the two. Anyways, this helmet was an early version of the bassinet, which was also something a knight might have worn during this time. The bassinet at its base really just extended further down the sides and back of the head and was topped with a tip instead of being rounded off. Visors were attached to this base bassinet helmet. The classic, what everybody knows to be the bassinet helmet, is this, which is a bassinet at its base with a houndskull visor attached to it. It's called houndskull because it looks like a muzzle of sorts. It's protruding out. Another helmet that was used more during the early part of the 14th century was this bad boy. I love this thing, and it's not just because of the name. It might just be because of the name. Meet the Sugarloaf helmet. This is a variation of the Great Helm, which is already a fantastic helmet. Very iconic. To get the Sugarloaf helmet, take the Great Helm and make it cute. It had padding on the inside, a strap underneath for your chin. You've got little holes for ventilation. There's no padding over these, obviously. They usually have a very prominent crucifix symbol on their front. If you wanted to lose some protection but gain the ability to breathe, there was always the kettle hat option. These were especially good during a siege where incoming projectiles would just bounce off the brim. You're probably pairing this with some chainmail, maybe a bever, which is a separate piece of plate armor that goes over your chin and throat. And over all of your armor, you would put a surcoat, which sometimes had a coat of arms on it, sometimes not. It was kind of a toss-up. If you were rich up the wazoo, this is silk. Some were sleeveless, some had elbow or wrist-length sleeves. If contemporary art is anything to go from, you got some pretty snazzy colors to choose from. They sort of keep getting shorter as the century moved on. By around 1330, they were around the thighs. All right. As for your weapons, you've got a few options. You've got a falchion. There are a couple different types of falchions. There's the cleaver falchion and the cusped falchion. The latter was a slimmer, straight blade with a curve at the end. And the cleaver falchion was a machete-like weapon. Take a machete and put a handguard on it, and you've got a falchion. At this time, you could have been using either one. The cleaver falchion went out of style after the 1300s, but the cusped falchion stayed around even till the 1500s. There were swords like this, which had a wheel pommel, which is the rounded bit you see on top, and this is specifically a thrusting sword that popped up in the mid-14th century. On some of these, there was a section right underneath the hilt called the ricasso, which was intentionally left blunt so that the user could place his fingers there in order to gain better thrusting power. You might have an arming sword. You'll know these by their cruciform style hilt, and they're usually around 27 to 31 inches long. These are a bit shorter than the longsword, which is around 31 to 43 inches. Whereas the arming sword is meant for single-handed use, the longsword is meant for both single-handed and two-handed use. Do keep in mind that long swords are heavier than arming swords in general. Pros and cons. For little weapons, rondel dagger. These little bad boys are really good at piercing through chainmail. That was their primary purpose, was stabbing. You can recognize a rondel dagger by its disc guard, so you can see they have a rounded guard right here to protect your hands. That is characteristic of a rondel dagger. You could find these in either single or double-edged blades. They often had a triangular blade that reached around 15 inches. Some other daggers you might have as a 14th century knight were the quillon dagger and ballock dagger. Common people carried the ballock dagger around during this time, but in war they were mainly used for finishing blows to the eye, underarm, or groin. These daggers varied from having a single to double-edged blade, usually around 10 to 16 inches long. They are called ballock daggers because they have two ovals on the hilt. So fucking funny. I'm laughing on the inside. Other weapons, such as lances, would have been taken into battle with you. These were built out of wood and tipped with steel or iron tips. Pretty early on in the century, van plates were added to these, which were a guard for your hands. You see all these pretty showy, flashy lances with beautiful decorations and different portrayals of history and media, but that's not what you're taking to battle. I'm sorry. It's not what you're taking to battle. Unless you're a showboat and you're not there for real fighting and you're just there to stand and be a pretty symbol, you're not taking a showy lance into battle. You're just going to destroy it, lose it. The showy lances are really a product of Tudor times, when jousting was a really big event and a show of pomp and wealth. What you're taking into battle is not necessarily going to be pretty. It's not meant to be. It's going to be destroyed. For this reason, van plates were not super common in war lances, because you're just going to lose it. Your lance is getting destroyed. You're just going to lose it on the battlefield, and that is what we like to call waste, and we try not to do that in medieval England. Following that, you might have a mace, a flanged mace. which is more for blunt force damage than anything. You're going to be hitting armored enemies with this to hopefully cause blunt force trauma and knock them down. Other weapons at your disposal are the poleaxe, really good weapon, 3 weapons in one really. You've got a top spike, an axe, a hammer. These could be anywhere from 4 to 8 feet long, so big variation there. They were designed to be used against plate armor. Again, you could use these for blunt force or grab at enemies and cut limbs off. Now that you've got all your gear, you may be wondering how you're gonna make money. That is a fair question. Upkeep of all your equipment and horses is not gonna be cheap. One option which stands out and in which you stand to gain a good chunk of money is that you could ransom someone. It sounds bad, but it's not as bad as you're thinking, I promise. Depending on who you captured and ransomed, this could be very profitable. Knights could usually be ransomed for quite a lot of money. There was sort of an unspoken rule that you don't ask for such a large ransom that the knight will be ruined and not be able to continue being a knight once he is free. Sometimes this unspoken rule didn't get observed by many people. There's actually a complaint documented by a writer in the 14th century about this very thing. He talks about how a lot of knights were asking for an ungodly amount of money. This was not knightly of them. Ransoming itself, when done correctly, was not seen as unchivalrous. That same writer wrote down his thoughts on it, and the general idea was that anything that you could gain from the enemy in war, you had a right to take. But knights were often worth a lot of money, lords even more so, and you just keep going up the ladder and it's more and more. Lord help me if you could ransom a king, oh my god. You're well done. You're set. Other than that, simply going to war and fighting and showing courage and valor was something that many knights aspired to do. If you did this, it's always a possibility that your lord or king will give you recognition for your loyalty. And in this way, you may be gifted a title, lands, national assets, which you can then continue to profit off of. If you're into tournaments, it sort of works the same way as ransoming in war, in that you could capture the enemy knight and ransom him. So that's another option. And then you could always pillage. I say that, but more what I mean is if you're besieging a city and you give that city the opportunity to surrender and they don't surrender, you could then come in and take their riches. It belongs to you now. Usually the riches were divided between the knights and soldiers, the commander, and the king. So you got a chance at getting a portion of 1/3 of the riches in the city. So now that you know about all the material objects you'll need to be a knight, what immaterial things will serve you? What mindset should you develop to be a knight? What code do you follow? In a word, chivalry. Everyone was obsessed with King Arthur. Everyone's still obsessed with King Arthur and his knights. Courage was a central point in a knight's code of chivalry, along with loyalty, truthfulness, and martial prowess. Your other obligation was to your lady, so show loyalty to your lady and show bravery in your endeavors to win her over. Besides your earthly duties, like loyalty to your lord, showing courage on the battlefield, you were also expected to have a role as a religious warrior and a soldier of Christ. So this idea was really popular during the Crusades to inspire knights to take up the cause, become soldiers of Christ and the church. This religious chivalry was at its height from the 11th to 13th centuries. After the last crusade, the idea went into decline. The Christians had not done so hot in the last crusade. They lost the Holy Land, so morale was pretty low. The idea of chivalry and the knight pivoted after this to a more secular take on chivalry. Instead of swearing fealty to God, you start seeing knights swearing fealty to their monarch. Brotherhoods based around this secular chivalry started to appear, most notably the Order of the Garter, which is still around today. Courtly romances started becoming more of an inspiration for knights. They took ideas from Arthurian legends and how those knights performed courageous deeds. Sir Galahad was the goat in the medieval mind. So as a 14th century knight, you're more likely than not swearing your loyalty to your monarch. And of course religion's in your mind when you do this, but it's no longer the pivotal factor in becoming a knight. They're not exactly as they were in crusading times. You're no longer necessarily a soldier of Christ so much as you're a soldier of king and country. The meaning of knighthood is more disconnected with the church now than it had ever been previously. So good news is you don't have to completely sell your soul to Christianity to become a knight anymore. I think that's a wrap. This video is already way longer than I wanted it to be. I hope that some of your questions about becoming a medieval knight were answered in this video. I'm here to tell you that if your dream is to become a medieval knight, go for it. Who's gonna stop you? Not me. I'm your biggest fan. Let me know if it works out. Tag me. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Have a good day, have a good life. Bye.